Hello, and welcome to today's session, Digital Future 2021, the most important tech trends leaders need to know now. My name's Jeremy Silver. I'm the CEO of Digital Catapult. The Digital Catapult is the UK authority on advanced digital technologies. And today, I'm absolutely delighted to announce the launch of the Digital Futures Report and Global Index, which is a brand new piece of research delivered to you from Digital Catapult. So in this session this morning, we're going to present you with an exclusive look at the findings of the research. We'll have a look at how the adoption of advanced technologies goes hand in hand with a growing economy. We'll look at the ranking of the UK's technology capability versus other countries around the world. And we'll explore 2 or 3 major game-changing trends that look as if they're really going to impact businesses across the UK in the coming 5 to 10 years. As well as some advice on how you can get involved as well. So today's webinar is being recorded. It will be available on Digital Catapult's YouTube channel in the coming days. And there's lots to cover this morning. So if there's time at the end, we may have a couple of minutes for questions from you, the audience, and we'll try to get to some before we close. So if you do have a question, please post those in the Q&A box. So that's enough for me for now. Let me introduce you to Digital Catapult's Director of Policy Research and Strategic Engagement, Phil Young, who's going to give us an overview of the Digital Futures Index for 2021. Phil, good morning.
Good morning, Jeremy, and thank you so much. And good morning, everyone, as well. Thank you for joining us today. Over the past 6 to 9 months, Digital Catapult's team of experts have embarked on a journey to capture the UK's global position across a range of advanced digital technologies. These technologies we perceive are going to define the future of the economy and society globally. So for us, advanced digital technologies are things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, virtual, augmented, mixed reality and haptics, the Internet of Things technologies, so things like sensors and wearables, distributed ledger technologies such as blockchain, and then 5G and advanced networks. If we can just move on to the methodology. Just before we get into the trends and the data, it is really important to note that the Digital Future Index has been constructed through extensive research. So we've had over 40 interviews and data analysis of 125 plus data set variables as well. These data sets come from a variety of sources, including things like patent data, OECD data, Crunchbase company data, and our own database and internal knowledge within Digital Catapult as well, which is extensive over the years that we've been working in this space. We've set these parameters then across 6 weighted pillars that span talent, innovation, commercial ventures, infrastructure, research, operating environment, and development. This data is then normalized into a value between 0 and 1 to create a score per technology. And then that's integrated together with infrastructure data, such as mobile network speeds and number of supercomputers to provide a total country score. This total country score then is weighted across the technologies and is how we have got to our top 30 countries in this area. And then the interviews, the research and other metrics have then fed into our 3 key trends for businesses and countries around the world. So moving on to the trends, what are they and why are they important? Firstly, it's crucial to highlight that advanced digital technologies are important in their own right. So the AI, VR, immersive technologies, IoT, 5G, they're all incredibly important in their own way. But it's also really important to start to think about how these technologies are converging. So it's not about just one technology, it's about how they converge into systems and architectures that can then be scaled into what we would describe maybe as cyber physical systems or cyber physical infrastructure applications as well. In terms of this convergence, we're starting to see biggest and most transformational opportunities in the world in these areas as we start to look to tackle challenges like net zero and create a new type of immersive and gesture-based internet layered over the real world in the form of the metaverse. So through our interviews, research and technology expertise, Digital Catapult has identified these 3 technology trends as emerging ones. The first one is the journey towards digital twins, or in other words, the steps being made towards establishing digital replicas of physical assets or environments linked together by a 2-way data model. The second is the rise of the metaverse, which we're starting to see play out through new media production techniques like virtual production, things like LiDAR and volumetric capture, but also the creation of new games engines and immersive technology powered social environments. These are all steps towards fully immersive and interactive cyber physical internet. And finally, the third trend is around remote and autonomous machines. So This might be around robotic systems, drones, vehicles, and other exciting evolutions that are underpinned by advanced digital technologies. But also it's looking at how these enable businesses to improve their operations, their supply chains, and their ability to work remotely, particularly as we come out of the pandemic. As these trends are emerging, it's making it all the more important for countries across the world to ensure that they have the best foundations possible for success in these areas. So what is becoming clear is that leadership in one technology is not really enough. And instead, we need to start to look at how we can foster better coordination and innovation across technologies and look to tackle challenges around openness and interoperability as well. So moving on to our top 10 countries. I'm pleased today to launch the Digital Future Index and highlight the top 10 countries in the world across these technology areas. As you can see, it's very exciting that the UK is leading Europe and coming in at third in the world behind the US and China. We have exceptional strengths across all of the technologies, putting us in a position of strength for the future. But we do need to do more around infrastructure, where we're currently ranked at 16th in the world, which, although is on par with Germany, is actually falling behind the APAC region and the US. If we move on to look in a little more detail at some of the statistics in the report for the UK, we can see a number of highlights as well. So for example, the UK has seen an estimated £10.4 billion of total funding into over 4,000 advanced digital technology companies over the past 10 to 15 years. In the past year alone, these companies have received a total of 2.46 billion investment, with 1.3 billion of that into AI, 505 million into IoT, 481 million into blockchain and distributed ledger technology companies, and 180 million into immersive technologies. The UK has significant strengths in our advanced digital technology company ecosystem, with the second highest number of AI, DLT, and immersive companies in the world behind the US, and the third highest number of Internet of Things companies. But despite these amazing statistics, which all sound great, the distribution of these companies by sector shows that the UK is at risk of falling behind in the fourth industrial revolution. We have low percentages of these companies focused on industrial applications of these technologies in sectors such as manufacturing and supply chains, with an average of only 4% of these UK-based companies having products and services targeted at either sector. Also, the UK is currently fourth in the world for immersive technologies, which will underpin the future of the spatial internet and metaverse capabilities as they emerge. Our immersive companies have only received a total of £592 million of funding since they were founded, but this is significantly behind the US, which has invested 11.8 billion, and China, which has invested 1.5 billion. The UK is also facing challenges in scaling our advanced digital technology companies. While we have high numbers of these companies, we are behind many other countries in average funding per company, placing 11th in immersive technologies and the Internet of Things, 5th in artificial intelligence. And while we're ranked second globally for average funding per company in blockchain and DLT, this average is actually also really low at just £1.6 million per company compared to the US at 8.9 million. And finally, just 4.1% of these companies in the UK are also generating revenues of over $10 million per year, compared to the US at around 7.4%. This is similar to a global average of 3%, but it does indicate a lack of global scale in the market outside of the US for these technologies, unable to meet the growing demand that is going to permeate across all different sectors. So on that note, I'd like to highlight that the UK really has the potential to leverage its emerging strengths in these areas and target them at opportunities that will yield the best results for the UK economy and the world in tackling things like climate change. On that note, I'd like to pass back to Jeremy, so we can discuss these findings across the panel with Naomi as well.
Excellent. Phil, thank you very much indeed. And really interesting and extraordinary to see some of those results coming through. But as you say, lots there to talk about. And joining us this morning, it's a real pleasure to introduce from the CBI, their Head of Innovation, Naomi Weir. Good morning, Naomi, and welcome.
Good morning.
Excellent. So I'd like to try and sort of pick up on some of those things that you've highlighted there, Phil. I think, you know, for some people, this might come as something of a surprise. So I suppose my question to both of you, and maybe Naomi, you'd like to start, is you know, what is it about the UK right now that makes it such a good innovator in advanced technologies relative to our neighbouring countries in Europe and around the world?
Thank you, Jeremy. And I think in part the nature of the question belies something that is very, very British, that is we're very good at underselling our capabilities and our strengths. Something we do individually, and it's something that we also do as a nation exceptionally well. And so I think one of the things that this report really helpfully highlights is that the UK has real strengths in some of these areas that we need to be better at telling the story of, because that then, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, has real knock-on effects for how we're perceived internationally as a place for investment, as a place for people locating their businesses and careers. So I think the first thing I'd say is actually, we know we've got a lot of strengths across these areas, and it's a great opportunity to highlight that, particularly at the beginning of Tech Week this week. I think the other thing I'd say is that we do have real potential to grow it. And so I think, although we do have strengths as the report and as Phil's highlighted, I think this is also a real opportunity to look at and analyse where we can really turn the dial to make sure that the UK doesn't have great potential that we don't capitalise on. And I think that's something that hopefully through the discussion we can look at a bit more as well.
It's very interesting, isn't it? There was a report in the FT this weekend about the extraordinary degree to which the large tech giants in the US have been acquiring smaller companies at an ever-increasing rate, particularly as they anticipate increased regulation. What do you think, Phil, in terms of responding to that? I mean, are we in a position where we could really scale these businesses? Do you think that there's a fundamental barrier to scaling them? Or what's the approach that we need to take there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the short answer is yes. I think we have a real opportunity to scale them. Obviously, when we're looking at this average amount of funding per company, I feel like there is a definite need to invest more into a subset or specific set of those companies, particularly where they're going to lead to real business opportunities and growth opportunities for the UK economy. I think it's very easy to kind of lead the market to its kind of devices, but what we're starting to see, and as we've seen through some of that distribution of the companies, is that they will often go to where there are opportunities for engagement with different sectors where there are customers at a ready pipeline of customers, whereas the opportunities in terms of exporting or growth or global potential really sits in our opportunity around the fourth industrial revolution, the opportunity to look at growing challenges around things like net zero, industrial net zero in particular, and their opportunities for building customer pipelines in areas like supply chains and manufacturing. And perhaps they're not areas that the UK will necessarily say we're ready to adopt AI and all of these technologies in right now to go at speed, but there are opportunities elsewhere where there is a real growth potential for some of these companies to scale into those new markets as well.
So Naomi, let me ask you, I mean, there was a time not so long ago, and people still talk about this, where they say, well, we're jolly good at doing this at an academic level, but when it comes to commercialization, we're not so good. And in fact, that was the sort of the leading idea that was really the inception of why the Catapults and the Catapult network was actually created. Based on this data, you might be forgiven for thinking that actually we're quite good at creating companies that are adopting this technology, but we're just not very good at scaling them. Is that what the new frontier is, do you think?
I think so. So the other thing I want to say was, this expertise that the UK has is really based on, excellent historical and research strength in the UK. We have an outstanding research base in the UK across academia and industry. In fact, it's a real area of strength for us, and you see that reflected in some of the areas where we have these strengths. We talked about some of the stuff around life sciences or health tech. We've got a really strong life sciences research base. That's an area of real strength, for example. But I think we do have a lot of startups. We've talked about this for quite a long time now as well, that we're great at starting companies. What about scaling? I think we've seen, what does commercialization mean? Actually bringing something through to being sort of commercially applicable or a new technology is one thing, but how do you get that sort of widespread use and market where it's actually really transforming the business environment and the kind of commercial potential? That's something that we have a lot of room for improvement on. And I think some of that is to do with scale. If you look at the other two countries in that list, the UK is a much smaller market, is a much smaller business base. If you look at the US or China, that's quite a different scale of country to be competing with. But that doesn't mean to say there aren't ways we can harness that for our potential in being quite a small nation comparatively, thinking about the kind of, packing a punch for a smaller country, the geographical potential from being a bit smaller, thinking about how we can join things up to really be a USP for the UK and investing in the UK in future is a real potential. But I think it is wrong to say we are good at research and bad at innovation. This really is another way of demonstrating that. But there are real challenges there for how do we make sure we've got the right building blocks in place so that the UK is a good option for staying and scaling, not just for starting.
So we're number 3 on average across this. Is there anywhere where we could actually become number 1, do you think?
So I think there are real areas where the UK has strengths. So if we look at some of the areas, so within AI, for example, that's somewhere where the UK has real potential, and that's demonstrated in the figures here, something we've seen at CBI as well in our research we've done around our sort of economic vision for the next 10 years, and seen that we've got all the building blocks in place to be a real global leader in AI. And I think one of the big things, and perhaps we can come to some of this because it does relate to the rest of the areas you've talked about in this report, is that real potential for thinking about trust in tech and ethics in AI. And I think that's somewhere where the UK has real potential, drawing on some of our historical expertise in this area, as well as some of the culture stuff, regulatory, rule of law, some of those areas where the UK could be a real world leader using that kind of ethical approach to technology development and adoption that could be a real USP for the UK going forwards. And that would then have knock-on effects across some of the other areas we look to, as Phil was saying, sort of drawing them together into some of the kind of the nexus between these technologies of what that application could look like. So I think those sorts of areas where the UK has a real advantage at the moment and potential to really be world leading could have knock-on effects in some of those other areas.
Very interesting. Phil, I mean, what does the index have to tell us about this? And it does seem as if there is an opportunity, as Naomi was suggesting, to respond in a more ethical and a more values-driven way to the opportunities of AI, and to resist some of the temptations of the big US giants that are now having to backtrack from that, but at the same time to not go down the route of such prescriptive consumer protectionist positions that the EU has adopted as to sort of stifle the innovation. Is there a middle, dare I say that a third way, but is there a middle path here?
I think absolutely. I think Naomi hits the nail on the head. Trust and the environment that we operate within the UK really allows you to build a sense of, particularly around, as you say, technologies like AI, where the input of data and the output of a solution or use case is absolutely vitally important to look about the integrity of that data. It means that business environment, the types of things that we layer on, and our norms and the types of standards and processes that we put in place, not just only a business level, but on a governmental level and at a startup level, and the interest that we apply to that really helps to underpin our capabilities in this space. It allows us to have, in comparative terms, even the China and US, actually a real advantage where we can actually build on that neutrality and that ability to create and foster ecosystems. The challenge we do have, though, is that what we need to do is scale platform providers. So at the moment, we are really good at creating ecosystems of companies and startups that can sit on platforms. So data platforms that can be produced or built, web platforms, et cetera, et cetera. But what would be really exciting is if we can start to identify companies who have the ability to scale as a technology platform for ecosystems to develop around. And I think that's where the UK, if we could also weave that into where we have our ethical approaches and our trust in the quality of the capabilities that we're building, we could really do that in a sustainable way that's beneficial not just for the UK economy, but also for the world. And we can look at how we can apply that to challenges like net zero and really help to open the doors and make more openness and interoperability between those platforms as well. So I think that would be really exciting if we can try and tackle some of those challenges as well.
What's your take on that, Naomi? Because there's an interesting sort of set of options there. There's a sort of perhaps a more traditional view that the UK is a great test territory, a small, self-contained but quite advanced territory, which is great for testing as a market. What Phil's suggesting is there's an opportunity to go beyond that and to start to create some new platforms here that have got the ability to be world scale, but to take that UK middle ground, if you like, as the DNA of how they'd be produced. I mean, perhaps both those things are true. What do you think?
I think in some ways there's no reason why the UK couldn't be a place that has some of these platforms themselves. It's in the digital realm. It's not something that requires enormous physical infrastructure in one sense. There is something to be said about digital infrastructure and connectivity, and we'll talk about that perhaps in a bit, because
just a minute.
That is related. So I don't see a reason why not, but I do think, you know, some of those then around scaling, we need to make sure that the UK is an attractive place to make the substantial investments that would need to be made to make something of global scale in terms of platforms, because, you know, you need to have that whole environment around in order to have sufficient scale for a company to be a global technology platform, for example. And I think at the moment that's not something we've quite cracked. We do, as you've said, you know, the amount of investment coming into the UK for tech is exceptionally large and is at the front of the pack in terms of the EU and Europe, our European neighbours. But actually, to be somewhere, the substantial amount of investment that needs to be able to come into the UK or into such a business in order to have it at sufficient scale to be a global platform that competes with, for example, the US platforms that are out there, is not something we're at yet.
Very interesting. I mean, there's an extraordinary figure that that the report comes up with, and I think you quoted it in your presentation, Phil, suggesting that about £10.4 billion worth of investment has come in over the last 10 years into companies in this space. Actually, over a 10-year period, that's not that huge, actually, is it? But perhaps just picking up on what Naomi was saying, this isn't just a question of size of investment. It's also a question of the environment, isn't it? I mean, what do you think needs to happen, not just at an investment level, but in terms of the environment, to really shift that picture?
Yeah, I think the first thing to note on that is that, of course, you know, we're starting to see increases in that amount as well. So £2.46 billion of investment into these technologies has come in within the last year, despite the pandemic, which again doesn't seem like a significant amount, but we are talking about only 4,000 companies. You may expect, because of all the hype around these technologies, that they are much more of these companies everywhere and anywhere, but they are still quite niche, and they are growing. They're still at that sort of period of nascent adoption. And I think that brings us to the second question, sort of the second part of the question, Jeremy, about the environment. In order to be able to get to a point where you can scale, you need to have a really good niche product or service that you can scale into a specific sector. So not just solving one particular challenge for one particular company. And I think McKinsey said it a few years ago, that there was a challenge around pilot purgatory, where lots of these emerging technology companies go in, they just basically do a pilot or a proof of concept on loop, and they will basically do you know, a 3-month project or 6-month project, build something, and then they'll go and apply it somewhere else, and et cetera, and so on and so forth. And the problem with that approach is that you don't then have a product or service that is scalable across a whole sector, or indeed multiple sectors. So in order for us to be able to get to a point where we can attract more investment and these companies can scale, it's not about necessarily, you know, another round of raised capital. It is also about creating customer pipelines and creating that revenue stream that allows them to grow into new markets. And that for the UK is a lot about export.
Is that also about ambition, do you think? I mean, is there a cultural mindset that needs to change here? Do we need to stop thinking about ourselves as a service sector and be thinking more about platform creation and ambition?
I think we can. I think there's a place for both, is the honest answer. I think we regularly focus on on application side technologies, because it's an easier thing to try and point things towards. So if you start to try and tackle a big thorny sort of global thing, where sector wide and it's multi geographies, to start at that point is quite a daunting task to try and sell it as a small company. We've got this global ambition, whereas in the US, I feel like they do that a little bit better, where they say they start off with a position where they're like, and this is going to be a global world-changing company from the outset, and this is what we're trying to achieve. Whereas in the UK, we're a little bit more like, we've got this specific problem that we're trying to solve, and we're going to solve it, and then that may lead to global growth.
Presumably, that's something that comes from both the investor side as well as the company side, isn't it? I mean, that we need to encourage people to broaden their horizons. Let's move on, because there's an awful lot in this index, and it'd be good to try and sort of just share more with people before they get to download it and read it all for themselves. What slightly more concerning data point that you mentioned in your presentation showed the UK in not such a high position in a really crucial area, it seemed. I mean, the third place ranking is in the aggregate, but despite performing well in some of those areas, when it comes to digital infrastructure and some of the underpinning capabilities, I think you said that we ranked 16 in the index. Is that something we should be worried about?
Yeah, past Naomi, because she can. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, digital infrastructure is an essential foundation for widespread innovation across the economy. So it's a must-have. I mean, we've all seen that at the less emerging, perhaps, end in terms of business resilience that's been linked to digital infrastructure and digital capabilities, and digital infrastructure and a massive enabling part of that. In fact, before this conversation, Phil was having difficulty because I had rather frozen and his internet wasn't managing to keep up. So at a very basic level is that, but then you layer on top of that actually the advanced applications and that we're talking about here, and you need reliable and fast, the digital infrastructure in order to deliver these, and that's both in terms of for the companies looking to actually operate them as well as those looking to develop them, and that needs to be a big part of the UK's offer. So it's certainly something at CBI that we've been really proactive on in terms of engaging with government about what, for example, gigabit rollout looks like, what that looks like in terms of 5G and the environment there. So I think, for that to be tackled will be a really, really big one for the UK. Future-proof gigabit digital infrastructure will help empower UK businesses to adopt the technology needed to lead in these industries that we're talking about. So it is a complete foundation. It is a challenge because it's now, it's vital infrastructure. It's national kind of what's the word? Commodity. We need it just like we need our electricity, we know water, but actually it's not given that level of investment or robustness yet. And so how do we make sure we move towards that? And it's both about the sort of supply side in terms of actually making that capability, but then also there's the kind of business side of it in terms of the adoption, to make sure that they are aware of why they might need these capabilities, and then investing to make sure that as a business they're able to access them. So I think it's both of those things.
It's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, the government's made a big push into broadband rollout. But of course, that largely is about consumer connectivity, which obviously helps industry. But in a sense, I think what you're suggesting here, Phil, and what comes out of the index is that this is the infrastructural gap may actually be more on the industrial side and on real industrial business support infrastructure, as much as it is on the consumer gap. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a mixed. Infrastructure means lots of different things in the sense of it's your underpinning. I mean, and as we've captured within the index as well, it's your underpinning digital infrastructure. So it's your mobile networks, it's your speed of internet, it's your simple things like access to electricity, all of those base level things that enable you to build things on top of. At the same time, it's also the right type of environment that you can build things within. So again, it's your academic excellence, it's your number of universities that have certain courses, etc., etc., etc. But when it comes down to your sort of network and advanced network infrastructure in particular, and perhaps your deployment of different infrastructure within the physical environment, I think the UK has a real opportunity to build capabilities that drive into these new trends. So and enable them to happen more effectively. So at the moment, we are ranked as actually 7th in the world for 5G progress, which is 2nd in Europe for that. And although we are 16th in infrastructure in general, I think our potential in 5G is actually, and the position that the UK government has taken around it, the DCMS 5G testbeds and trials program, for example, and the great work that organizations like the CBI do in promoting the value of 5G, all of those things have enabled us to actually generate the momentum in not just your classic network deployment from telcos, but also in business environments, so industrial applications of 5G and things like that. And I think that really does set us up to push on above that 16th place. And 16th place sounds terrible as well, but we are on par with the likes of Germany, we are on par with the likes of Canada and other sort of European nations. It's just that as the West and Europe and the US, we really are starting to fall away from rapid deployments of these types of capabilities in countries like China and South Korea and Singapore. And we really need to make sure that we don't fall so far behind that we can't, when it comes to deploying these technologies in business contexts and in built environments, that we don't fall away so that we can't catch up.
So let's have look at this again from perhaps more from the business perspective. If I'm an industry leader or an industrialist from a traditional sector, an awful lot of these phrases, the metaverse, autonomous vehicles, they just sound like buzzwords. They sound like the kind of hype that is the stuff of Sunday magazines, but isn't necessarily the stuff of real industry. What do we? Is that a real perception that we have to counter? I mean, how do we address that concern? Because obviously we all know that at the leading edge of digital technologies in particular, there are lots of bumps in the road and things that don't necessarily quite deliver the expectations that they should, and so on. It takes time for these things to evolve. And yet, in a sense, what you're suggesting here is that actually a lack of investment in the infrastructure, but also perhaps that skepticism in industry might end up with us failing to adopt at the speed we need to. Is that a real concern, do you think? Is that, Naomi?
Well, I think in one sense, some of these things really are buzzwords to a lot of business leaders and are very, very divorced from what they'll be doing and their investment plans. And that's a reality. We're talking about the leading edge here, where the UK does have a capability to be world leading, but that isn't going to be a reality for the majority of firms for a very long time. So in one sense, yes. In another sense, there are a lot of firms where this is what they're looking to in their mid to long-term horizons of where they need to be investing in capabilities, in skills, in infrastructure, and what that looks like for them. So I wouldn't want to say this kind of is a top of the to-do list for every business leader, because it's really not. But there are knock-on effects, or we can see the kind of wider implications of this for a much wider pool of businesses as well. So, thinking about basic digital adoption has been accelerated light years in the last 2 years. So that then paves the way for much more data-driven decisions being made by businesses. But at the moment, lots of businesses are just saying, I've got so much data, don't know what to do with it. And so it's not getting that value. But that's a massive baseline for then these future steps. So things like how to invest to make sure that you can get the value out of your data is going to be a big thing for a lot of CBI members of businesses across the country, as they've got greater access to it. So how can they make use of that for serving their customers, for their internal operations, for their net zero goals, for the development of their products and services? So that's one big area, which is a kind of baby step towards some of the stuff that we're talking about, but it's going to be really important for actually thinking about those future markets for those looking to invest at this leading edge. So the adoption of sort of the perhaps more existing, not right at the leading edge, but that sort of emerging end of technologies, that will form the basis of what the kind of UK market will look like for businesses looking to invest at the more leading edge in the future. So these are, are in some ways far off for many businesses, but also it's not the stuff of science fiction. It is the reality for a lot of businesses, and actually we would do well to tell some of these stories better so that businesses can see what that looks like for them. We perhaps might come to this, but some of those, one of the things when we're engaging with the government around some of the strategies and guidance for firms is actually, talk about the art of the possible. What could this actually look like? Those real life use cases, which is so important for businesses to see. Others have used this in this way. That's what I could do, and we could get those real gains here. So I think we'll need to do that better as these, as you say, these buzzwords that we currently hear about, metaverse and the like, but actually there are some real world kind of not too far distant future applications for businesses, and being able to get a kind of community of business leaders much more familiar with this, I think is something that actually the accelerated digital adoption we've seen in the pandemic has switched many more business leaders onto, and what those possibilities look like.
Yes. So Phil, do you think there are some sectors more than others where really getting to grips with some of these technologies is becoming more of a priority? I mean, it's obviously not the same level of value today across every sector, but are there some for whom it's becoming really increasingly vital for success?
Yeah, I mean, to touch upon these sort of the trends as well, I completely agree with Naomi. But we're a bit of a journey for some of these things in terms of the semantics as well, in terms of the maturity of these technologies. They're going to last, metaverse and digital twins are buzzwords, but over the next 10 years, they'll become sort of a level of maturity to them that they will be deployable, usable, and have much clearer kind of platform-based use cases and examples, which are much more scalable. But to sort of talk about where that's being applied and where that offers the most potential, I think when we look at the metaverse, for example, I mean, the real immediate thing that comes to mind is that we're going to move from potentially within the next 10 years from fingers on screens to a more interactive, gesture-based, immersive internet. And that's both exciting and also quite scary at the same time, because it's a complete change in the way that we interact with data and information. And as that becomes more pervasive, it can change all different aspects of how we live and work. So I think in terms of consumer applications, we're going to really see that start to emerge quite quickly over the next few years. We're starting to see a number of companies in the UK and elsewhere really investing into and building out products and services in that space. So I think from a media, entertainment, gaming perspective, that's going to be a really exciting area of growth. And I think we'll see that as the biggest kind of area. And there will then be knock-on effects as well from that into other sectors. So as we start to see that emerge, you'll start to see opportunities for using those types of interfaces in different domains, like in the manufacturing domain on a factory floor, for example, or it could be in construction projects, or in a smart city context. So there's a whole host of things there. And then on digital twin side, I think we are starting to see a real emerging kind of interest in it in the built environment, in energy systems and the like. Some other areas like manufacturing and supply chains are starting to look at how they can use these types of technologies. But again, it's all about trial and error. It's really the early stages of it. The key thing for us is to build out a view of where pipelines and opportunities exist, and then look at how we can scale them. And that's the crucial component to this. I know, to hark back to our scale up conversation, that's the really crucial bit for us to get right. And I think we can only do that at this moment in trial and error and seeing where things can work and where they can't.
And just, if I may, to the point about kind of, what does this actually look like? You talk about digital twins, it can sound very up there, and who's using that? So, for example, one of our members, Northumbrian Water Group Utilities Company, working in partnership with Newcastle University, creating a kind of mapping the entire sort of water infrastructure of Newcastle that will allow real-time resilience testing. Won't have to dig up the roads on a kind of whim to see what would happen, but actually, rapid response to events such as flooding or drought, informing future investment decisions. Those kind of, that's real, and that's something that's in development now. And that's not kind of, doesn't feel far off techie when you're talking about it as your water company, but actually, how can you use these things in the kind of different business scenarios that we see? So real potential, but I think having those rooted to think of what those possibilities might be takes it out of buzzword into sort of reality and strategy for businesses.
Absolutely.
So we've only got about 5 minutes left because we will have to stop promptly on the half hour. But there are a few questions coming in from our viewers, and I just wanted to see if I could pick up on a couple of them with you. First of all, there's a sort of a factual question, Phil, that you might be able to answer. Looked at the numbers in relation to infrastructure, and just wanted to know whether the private connectivity, so private networks for 5G in factories and that kind of thing, was that taken into account of in your analysis of infrastructure and our standing in infrastructure?
So I think in terms of 5G, the data that we provided within the index, in particular, there's the 5G progress table that comes from Omdia, actually, rather than ourselves, does take into account a variety of different elements around 5G progress. So for that, it's 5G coverage, spectrum availability, service provider launches, ecosystems, and 5G take-up. Within that context, I mean, I completely agree with Anna. Private 5G is going to be absolutely crucial. And the UK has a big potential in that, in the fact that we've opened up our spectrum auction to potential for private 5G. I think we're one of only a few countries at the moment who have done that. And all of that is kind of taken into consideration within the 5G progress side. In terms of our own infrastructure, it's not something that we've captured within the index specifically, because it's really incredibly difficult to unpick at this stage. But it might be something that we feature in future versions. But it is I completely agree with Anna. It is a really important component, particularly as we start to think about how it can be deployed into different sectors and industries, for sure.
Excellent, thanks, Phil. Another question that's coming, just going back to our conversation earlier about AI and whether the UK can develop its own sort of position on this, asks, to what extent will trust in AI depend on UK AI specific regulation, and what would such regulation require to make them trustworthy? Naomi, thoughts on that?
Thank you. Yes, so I think there's two things here. There's the sort of what's the regulatory and standards environment that we create, and actually, you know, there's a lot of digital regulation happening at the moment. We're expecting the AI strategy out later today, which will hopefully have a bit more direction within that on some of these issues. So some of it is around the kind of environment that is set up by our regulation and standards, and some of it is also about kind of the practices that businesses put in place. So that could be to do with the governance structures around AI, could be to do with transparency and explicability of results, and what are the norms that we put in place around how we do that. What are those kind of contracts we put in place with users about how we will engage with them when it comes to AI? What are the ways which we can make sure we are doing that real transparency and good governance approach at a business level, as well as at a kind of national regulatory and standards level. And so, you know, business has a big role to play in making this really work well, and it can be a real differentiator for businesses as well, individually, regardless of what the UK regime looks like. And that is something we think from consumers as well as the public and other kind of suppliers. You know, what does that look like in your supply chain? What's your responsibility as a business to make sure that you can understand what those decisions look like through your supply chain, and what governance have you put in around that? So I think there's some things which will be at a national level, but some things that really businesses have to take ownership of, and can use that as a real selling point as well in terms of trust in tech and in the application of it.
Absolutely, and we should add that the Digital Catapult has been running a program called Machine Intelligence Garage for the last 3 years, and which continues to run, which has a very strong AI ethics component and offers companies the opportunity to have a deep dive specifically on this topic. So it's been very interesting to see what's come out of that, and I think it's really helped direct companies in some very interesting ways. We are almost completely out of time, and so my apologies to those of you who asked questions that we haven't managed to get to answer. I hope that in one way or another we've answered those questions in the comments from the panel. Can I just say a huge thank you to our panelists, to Naomi Weir and to Phil Young. Thank you very much for everything that you've contributed today. I hope you found this session insightful and useful. The report is now live for you to read and download via our website and from the London Tech Week virtual booth. So thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Goodbye.